Story 1. Born on January 13, 1963, Peter Gerard Scully was raised in Melbourne, Australia. Little is known about his childhood, though it is believed he was raised Catholic by two strict Scotch-Irish parents. After graduating from university, Peter became a property developer and accumulated significant wealth. By the mid-2000s, Peter was living with his wife and two children in a large four-bedroom house in suburban Melbourne, leading a life that many would envy. However, in 2011, his world began to unravel. Peter and his partners were forced to declare bankruptcy after a development scheme failed, leaving them unable to account for the $2.6 million investment fund. Although Peter claimed the losses were legal, he was already preparing to flee the country. For years, Peter had been scamming investors in what amounted to a Ponzi scheme. By the time his illegal activities were exposed, he had already fled Australia on a false passport, establishing a new identity in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Once in Manila, Peter moved to the southernmost island of Mindanao to avoid detection. Although he had managed to flee with a substantial amount of money, his lavish lifestyle quickly depleted his funds. Unable to earn a living legally, Peter turned to the darkest corners of the internet, the exploitation of children. With the help of two Filipino women, Carmela Alvarez and Liesl Margallo, Peter set up one of the most depraved child exploitation websites in history. Peter would send Alvarez and Margallo to poor towns and villages in Mindanao, where they would promise generous financial compensation to parents willing to allow their children to participate in a photo shoot. The children would return a few days later, visibly shaken but with cash in hand. The abuse inflicted on these children was recorded and uploaded to a dark web forum that Peter created, called No Limits Fun. The most notorious video was titled Daisy's Destruction, depicting the horrific abuse of three underage Filipino girls. Peter offered the full, unedited recording for $10,000. One of the most active abusers in the video was Liesl Margallo, who had herself been trafficked as a child. For 5 years, Peter and his accomplices continued to traffic and abuse children until Carmela Alvarez had a change of heart. She pressured Peter to introduce alcohol to the girls to reduce their suffering during the abuse. In 2015, Peter lured two teenage girls to his home with the promise of food and alcohol. When the girls realized they were to be abused, they tried to escape but were caught, beaten, and forced to dig their own graves. Peter planned to bury them alive but decided to keep them for a few more days to ensure their silence. During this time, Carmela Alvarez discovered the girls chained in the basement. Horrified, she freed them and went to the nearest police station, revealing the entire grim story. To infiltrate Peter's dark web ring, Filipino police enlisted the help of the Dutch National Child Exploitation Team. Their white hat hackers quickly breached the website's defenses, uncovering a vast collection of exploitative images involving thousands of victims. Peter's own contributions were just the tip of the iceberg. The millions of dollars in cryptocurrency seized from his digital wallet revealed the sheer volume of his operations. Peter was eventually tracked down and arrested in Malaybalay City on February 20, 2015. His arrest led to the apprehension of another Australian predator, 22-year-old Matthew Graham, who ran violent child exploitation websites under the pseudonym Lux. Peter Scully faced 75 criminal charges, mostly related to trafficking and exploiting children. He was tried alongside a Brazilian, Jânio Caetano de Oliveira, and a German, Christian Rausch, who played intimate roles in recording and disseminating Peter's crimes. The trial was so harrowing that several jury members sought psychological counseling. At its conclusion, Peter was sentenced to life in prison, with a second conviction in 2022 adding 129 years to his sentence. Peter has complained about the conditions in the overcrowded and underfunded prison where he is held, but his complaints garner little sympathy. His imprisonment barely made a dent in the ongoing fight against child exploitation, as many more predators like him continue to lurk in the darkest corners of the web. However, for every predator, there are dedicated law enforcement agents working tirelessly to bring them to justice. Story 2. A couple of years ago, when I was in high school, I was hanging out with some friends who started talking about the deep web. My friend George had been on it before and was sharing some of the things he had seen. We discussed the deep web throughout our lunch period, and my curiosity grew. I decided to try it out for myself. Later that day, after school, I messaged George, who guided me on how to access the deep web. I followed his instructions and successfully got online. The first website I visited had a black screen with a small icon in the upper left corner. When I clicked on it, the page loaded with a series of images, including animals and random objects. I clicked on a fish, and the page started loading slowly, taking about 30 seconds. When the page finally loaded, I was horrified to see my face on the screen. It was coming from my webcam. I quickly grabbed a blanket to cover the webcam, and the screen went black. But then, text started appearing on the screen, typing out my full name, my school, my phone number, and even my city and state. I was terrified and tried to close the browser, but my mouse was frozen. I pressed Ctrl-Alt-Delete multiple times, but nothing happened. Panicking, I pressed random buttons on my keyboard, turned off my monitor, and finally unplugged my computer from the wall. After a few minutes, I plugged my computer back in and deleted the browser. Fortunately, I had already planned to get a new computer, which I did shortly after this terrifying experience. I will never forget my encounter with the deep web. Story 3. I used to visit the deep web frequently. I've always been into computers, and my friends and I would occasionally explore the deep web out of curiosity. One day I was alone in a deep web chat room. I enjoyed watching people talk, occasionally joining the conversation. On this particular day, one of the users in the chat mentioned me. We were having a conversation, but it quickly turned into an argument. The other user threatened me, saying he was going to get me. I assumed he was joking and responded with a wisecrack, which made him even angrier. Feeling uncomfortable, I decided to leave the chat and logged off. About 10 minutes later, I received a text message from an unknown number saying, "Why did you leave? This was creepy." But knowing that skilled hackers frequented the deep web, I wasn't entirely surprised. I decided to ignore the text, hoping it was just someone trying to scare me. A couple of hours later, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered, but there was only breathing on the other end. I hung up and tried to go about my day. However, a few minutes later, I noticed a car parked in front of my house. I couldn't see who was inside due to the angle and the darkness outside. The car didn't move for hours, and eventually I tried to get some sleep. I covered all the windows and double-checked the locks before going to bed. The next morning, I was relieved to see that the car was gone. However, when I turned on my computer, I found several open files, photos of my house, my car, and even one of me sleeping, taken from my bedroom doorway. I was shocked and terrified. I ran around the house checking every room, but no one was there. I realized my front door was unlocked and I had no idea how they had gotten inside. For the next few days, I was constantly looking over my shoulder and checking out the window. Everything seemed fine until about a week later when I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise in my room. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw a man walking past my room. This time I immediately called the police. As I did, I heard the person leaving my house. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, and I explained everything to them. I know I should have called the police the first time, but I felt foolish for going on the deep web in the first place. The police took down my information and promised to patrol the neighborhood over the next few nights. Nothing more has happened since, and I have never visited the deep web again. Story 4. This story took place in the mid-2000s when I was in high school. My favorite thing to do after school was play on my computer. I wasn't one of the popular kids, but gaming was always fun for me. One day I heard about the deep web and decided to try it out for the first time. I was pretty good with technology, so I figured out how to access the deep web fairly easily. I visited a couple of normal websites, but the more time I spent, the more unusual websites I found. Some of these sites were the craziest I had ever seen. I remember coming across a website filled with puzzles and codes. I looked at them for about 10 to 15 minutes, trying to understand them. Suddenly, my fax machine started printing something. A paper with a large series of numbers came out. I had no idea how this was happening. Then, it printed another paper, and then another. I started to get creeped out, so I took all the remaining paper out of the printer to stop it. My printer kept trying to print things, and then my phone started ringing. It was an old landline, and we barely used it anymore. I picked it up, but there was no one on the other end. There was only silence, but I knew someone was there. I quickly hung up. After about 5 minutes, my computer started acting funny. It began opening files, scrolling through websites, and closing programs all by itself. I was terrified. Then, my computer typed the word hello. I was horrified and turned it off immediately. Looking back, I realize how foolish I was to mess around on the deep web. I never went back on after that day, and I still have no idea what happened. All I know is that it felt like I was being watched, and I never want to experience that again. Story 5. Several years ago, I had a rather unsettling experience that made me stay far away from the deep web. I used to be very curious about the darker corners of the internet, especially after hearing about all the strange and bizarre things one could find there. My curiosity got the better of me, and one night I decided to explore the deep web. I downloaded the necessary software, ensuring I had all the recommended security measures in place. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but I wanted to see if the rumors were true. I browsed through various forums and sites, mostly coming across weird but relatively harmless stuff. Then I stumbled upon a site that caught my attention. It was a chat room, but it was different from the others. There was something eerie about it. I noticed that the chat was filled with strange symbols and codes, almost like a secret language. Occasionally, a normal message would appear, usually just a single word like yes or no. I couldn't make sense of it, but my interest was piqued. I watched the chat for a while, trying to decipher what was going on. After some time, I decided to type something in the chat, just to see if anyone would respond. I simply typed, "Hello," almost immediately. A reply popped up, "Why are you here?" That was it. Just 4 words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated before replying, just looking around. The chat went silent for a moment, and then the same user responded, "Leave now." Well, that was enough for me. I decided to take their advice and closed the chat. But as I was about to shut down my computer, a message appeared on my screen. It wasn't in the chat, it was a separate pop-up window. The message said, "We told you to leave." I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. Before I could react, my computer started behaving strangely. Windows were opening and closing on their own, and strange files were being downloaded without my consent. I panicked and tried to disconnect from the internet, but nothing was working. It was like my computer was possessed. Finally, in a moment of desperation, I held down the power button and forced my computer to shut down. I was shaking and completely freaked out. I unplugged the computer and didn't turn it back on for days. When I finally did, I immediately wiped the hard drive and reinstalled the operating system, hoping to erase any trace of what had happened. I never ventured into the deep web again, and to this day I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed in that chat room. Story 6. On a dreary night, a seasoned Redditor, known for his explorations of the dark web, decided to dive deeper into the most obscure corners of the internet. He had been on the dark web before, browsing through the eerie silence of the forbidden markets and forums. But this time, he stumbled upon something far more sinister. The web page was a basic, old-fashioned HTML page with a black background and red, dripping letters that read the dance of the dance curious, and a bit jaded by the mundane horrors he had seen before. He clicked the link. The screen flickered, as if it were struggling to load something it shouldn't. Then, the video began. A woman stood in a dimly lit room, her face obscured by shadows. She wore a tattered, old-fashioned dress, reminiscent of another era. The haunting melody of a piano echoed in the background as she swayed side to side. At first it seemed like an old, forgotten video of someone dancing, but as the camera panned out, the true horror was revealed. In her arms was a decaying corpse, dressed in what looked like a suit from the 1800s. The flesh was rotting, maggots crawling through what remained of the skin, and the stench of death seemed to seep through the screen. The woman, however, danced with it as if it were a beloved partner. She twirled the corpse around, lifting it gently, as if careful not to break it. Her face, once obscured, was now visible. She was smiling, but it was a smile that spoke of madness, of a mind long lost to the abyss. She whispered sweet nothings to the corpse, pressing her cheek against its skeletal face, and at one point she kissed it tenderly on the forehead. The video continued for several minutes, each second more disturbing than the last. Finally, the woman stopped dancing and slowly turned to face the camera. Her smile widened into a grotesque grin as she held the corpse close. She stared directly into the lens, as if looking into the soul of the viewer, before whispering, "Join us." The screen went black, and the video ended. The Redditor sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. He quickly closed the browser and shut down his computer, but the image of that woman and her decaying dance partner was burned into his memory forever. He never returned to the dark web again, haunted by the fear that she was still out there, waiting for someone to join her macabre dance. Story 7. John was your typical high school senior, good grades, popular, and a bit too curious for his own good. One night, after a long day of school and football practice, he decided to unwind by exploring the dark web. He had heard stories, both from friends and online, about the strange and terrifying things you could find there, but he never took them seriously. To him, it was all just a thrilling game, a way to kill time and maybe find something exciting. He navigated through various forums and marketplaces, each one offering more illicit and bizarre goods than the last. It was all fun and games until he stumbled upon a site that advertised a service called The Visitor. The description was vague, promising a unique experience for those brave enough to enter their address. The thrill seeker in John thought it was just another scam, a joke to scare the naive, so he decided to play along. With a grin, he typed in his home address and hit enter. The site confirmed his order with a simple message: "Your visitor is on the way." John chuckled to himself, closed his laptop, and went to bed, convinced that nothing would come of it. But as the night wore on, John's sleep was interrupted by a loud, persistent knocking at the front door. Groggy and disoriented, he glanced at the clock. It was 3 a.m. His heart began to race as he remembered the order he had placed. The knocking continued, growing more forceful. Cautiously, he got out of bed and crept down the stairs, each step echoing in the silent house. Through the peephole, he saw a man standing on the porch, his face obscured by the hood of a dark coat. The man held a small, unmarked package in one hand and a knife in the other. John's breath caught in his throat as the man knocked again, this time louder, more insistent. "Open the door," John, the man said in a calm, chilling voice. "I have something for you." John's mind raced. How did this stranger know his name? He had to be joking. It was all a sick prank, right? But the fear in his gut told him otherwise. Slowly he backed away from the door, trying not to make a sound. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. The man continued to knock, each thud on the door matching the pounding of John's heart. Suddenly the knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. John dared to peek through the peephole again, but the man was gone. Relieved, he let out a shaky breath and turned to go back upstairs. But then he heard a faint, scraping sound coming from the back of the house. John's blood ran cold as he realized the man was trying to get in through the back door. He bolted upstairs to his parents' room, but they were out of town for the weekend. Alone and terrified, John locked himself in his room, clutching a baseball bat for protection. Minutes felt like hours as he sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of someone moving around outside. Finally, the noise stopped. The silence stretched on, and John wondered if it was finally over. He waited, not daring to move until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. When morning came, John cautiously ventured downstairs. The back door was slightly ajar, but there was no sign of the man. On the front porch, he found the small package the man had been holding. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it, revealing a simple note inside: "Next time, answer the door." John never went on the dark web again, and he spent the rest of the weekend in a state of paranoia, unable to shake the feeling that the man would return. The dark web had seemed like a harmless curiosity, but now it was a nightmare he couldn't escape. Story 8. Lily was a young woman who had recently moved to a new city to start a job. To help alleviate the loneliness, she spent many nights browsing the internet, including the dark web. Though she was aware of its dangers, her curiosity got the best of her. She stumbled upon a strange forum where users shared stories and experiences that seemed too bizarre to be true. One thread caught her eye. It was titled "The Smiling Man." The thread contained several posts from different users, all describing encounters with a man who appeared in their homes, uninvited and unannounced. The descriptions were eerily similar. The man was tall and thin, wearing a well-tailored black suit, with a smile that stretched impossibly wide across his face. His eyes, according to the posts, were vacant, like black holes that seemed to suck in all the light around them. Each story ended the same way. The smiling man would simply stand there, in the dark corner of their room, grinning at them, his eyes fixed on them as they slept. Some users claimed he would disappear if they blinked or turned away, only to reappear closer than before. Others said he would speak, his voice a low whisper, promising that he would return. Lily was disturbed by the stories, but convinced herself they were just fiction. That night she went to bed, trying to push the images of the smiling man out of her mind. But as she lay there in the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She turned on her side, facing the wall, and tried to sleep. It was around 3 a.m. when she woke up to the sound of soft footsteps in her room. Her heart began to race as she listened, too scared to move. The footsteps stopped, and she could feel a presence in the room with her. Slowly, she turned her head to look, and there, in the corner, stood the smiling man. Just as the stories had described, he was tall and thin, his suit immaculate, and his smile unnaturally wide. His eyes were dark, empty voids that seemed to swallow all the light. He stood there, grinning at her, his head tilted slightly, as if studying her. Paralyzed with fear, Lily wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. The smiling man took a step closer, his smile never wavering. He took another step, and then another, until he was standing at the foot of her bed. He leaned in close, his face inches from hers, and whispered in a voice that was both soothing and terrifying, "I'll see you again." Suddenly, Lily was able to move. She scrambled out of bed, turning on every light in her apartment, but the smiling man was gone. The room was empty, yet the feeling of his presence lingered, as if he had left a part of himself behind. Lily never went back to the dark web, and she never told anyone about what happened that night. But every time she turned off the lights, she couldn't help but feel that the smiling man was still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Story 9. Mark had always been fascinated by the dark web, lured in by its mystery and the promise of uncovering secrets that were hidden from the average person. After months of exploring various forums and marketplaces, he started hearing rumors about something called the Red Room. It was said to be a live-streamed event where viewers could watch unspeakable horrors unfold in real time. The idea intrigued Mark, though he was skeptical. He had seen his fair share of hoaxes on the dark web, but the Red Room was different. It was whispered about in hushed tones, mentioned only in the most secretive circles. Determined to find out if the rumors were true, he spent weeks searching, piecing together clues and following leads that led him deeper into the dark web than he had ever gone before. One night he finally found a simple, unmarked link buried in a forum dedicated to the darkest corners of the web. The link led to a black screen with a red button in the center that read "Enter" without hesitation. Mark clicked the button, and the screen flickered to life. He was taken to a live video feed of a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a single chair, its surface stained with dark, unidentifiable substances. The walls were bare, and the only source of light came from a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the camera recording the scene. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he waited, unsure of what to expect. After a few moments, the door to the room opened, and a man was dragged in by two figures dressed in black. The man struggled, his eyes wide with terror, but he was no match for his captors. They forced him into the chair and bound him with thick ropes, rendering him helpless. Mark's blood ran cold as he realized what he was witnessing. The rumors were true, the Red Room was real, and he was about to watch a man be tortured live. He wanted to look away, to close the browser and forget he had ever found the link, but something kept him glued to the screen. The two figures in black stepped back, revealing a third person who had entered the room. This one wore a red mask that covered his entire face, giving him an eerie, faceless appearance. He approached the man in the chair, who was now sobbing, begging for mercy. But there was no mercy to be found in the Red Room. The masked figure began his work, using various instruments of torture that were laid out on a table beside the chair. The screams of the victim echoed through Mark's speakers, each one more agonizing than the last. The masked figure was methodical, almost surgical in his approach, as if he had done this many times before. Mark's stomach churned, but he couldn't bring himself to look away. He watched in horror as the man's life was slowly, painfully extinguished, his body left broken and bloodied in the chair. When it was over, the masked figure turned to the camera and bowed, as if he were an actor who had just finished a performance. The screen went black, and a message appeared, "Thank you for watching." Mark sat there in stunned silence, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. He closed the browser and shut down his computer, but the images of the Red Room were burned into his memory. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, had been watching him too, that he had just become part of a game far more twisted than he could ever imagine. Story 10. Tom had always been a skeptic, dismissing any stories about the dark web as mere urban legends or exaggerated accounts meant to scare people. He was a computer science student with a logical mind and a knack for debunking myths. When he heard about a particular dark website known as the Echo Chamber, where visitors supposedly encountered a sinister version of themselves, he was more intrigued than afraid. Determined to prove it was just another hoax, Tom decided to investigate. He scoured forums and chat rooms, gathering bits and pieces of information until he finally pieced together a link. The site was well hidden, its address passed around only in the most obscure corners of the dark web. When he finally accessed it, the screen was blank save for a single text box that asked for his name. Tom hesitated for a moment, then typed in his full name and hit enter. The screen flickered, and a video feed appeared. At first, Tom saw nothing but static, but then the image began to clear. He realized he was looking at a room that was eerily similar to his own. The camera seemed to be placed in the exact same position as his own webcam, facing his bed and desk. As he stared at the screen, his heart began to race. Everything in the video matched his surroundings perfectly. Then, a figure appeared in the frame. It was him. Or at least it looked like him. The figure on the screen moved in sync with Tom's own movements, but something was off. The other Tom had a cold, emotionless expression, his eyes staring directly into the camera with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the screen. Tom leaned in closer, studying the figure. Suddenly, the other Tom smirked, a twisted, malevolent smile that sent a chill down his spine. He recoiled from the screen, but the figure remained, now grinning from ear to ear. The lights in Tom's room flickered, and he felt a sudden drop in temperature. He looked back at the screen, and to his horror, the other Tom had stood up and was walking toward the camera. The real Tom instinctively glanced around his room, but he was alone. When he looked back at the screen, the other Tom was no longer there. The feed cut to static, and the text box reappeared, this time with a single message: "You can't escape yourself." Tom frantically tried to close the browser, but his computer was unresponsive. The lights flickered again, and this time they went out completely, plunging his room into darkness. He could hear his own breathing, quick and shallow, as fear gripped him. Then he heard footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible, but they grew louder, closer. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for his phone, but his hands were trembling too much to hold it steady. The footsteps stopped right outside his door. Tom held his breath, listening intently. There was a long moment of silence, followed by the sound of the door creaking open. He couldn't see anything in the darkness, but he could feel the presence of someone, something, standing just out of sight. A cold hand grabbed his shoulder, and Tom screamed. The lights flickered back on, and Tom found himself sitting alone in his room. The computer screen was blank, his door was closed, and everything was as it should be. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, lingered. He couldn't shake the sense that the other Tom, the one from the echo chamber, was still out there, waiting for the right moment to take his place. Story 11. Lucy had always been drawn to the paranormal, spending hours watching ghost hunting shows and reading about haunted places. Her fascination led her to the dark web, where she hoped to find real evidence of the supernatural. One night, she came across a forum discussing a mysterious video that supposedly showed the face of a ghost. The video, known as "The Face in the Static," was said to have a curse attached to it. Those who watched it would begin to see the face everywhere, slowly driving them insane. Intrigued, Lucy tracked down the video. It was hosted on an obscure site, buried deep in the dark web. The video was short, only about a minute long, and consisted of nothing but static. As she watched, she noticed something odd. A faint image began to emerge from the noise. The longer she stared, the clearer it became. It was a face. The face was grotesque, twisted with rage, its eyes wide and unblinking. It stared directly at Lucy through the screen, its mouth opening as if to scream, though no sound came out. Mesmerized, Lucy couldn't look away. The static intensified, and the face grew more distorted, more horrifying. Suddenly, the video cut off, leaving Lucy staring at a blank screen. She shook her head, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over her. She closed the browser and went about her evening, trying to forget about the video. But as the days went on, she began to notice something strange. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse of face in the reflection of a window, a shadow in the corner of her eye. But the face was always the same twisted expression, the same wide, unblinking eyes. Lucy tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a trick her mind was playing on her after watching the video. But the sightings became more frequent, more vivid. She saw the face in her bathroom mirror, in the reflection of her phone screen, even in the patterns of her bed sheets. One night, she woke up in a cold sweat, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. She turned on the bedside lamp, but the room was empty. As she lay back down, she glanced at the mirror on her dresser, and there it was. The face was staring at her from the mirror, its mouth wide open in a silent scream. Lucy screamed and threw the mirror across the room, shattering it into pieces. But when she looked at the shards on the floor, she saw dozens of tiny faces staring back at her, each one a perfect replica of the original. Terrified, Lucy shut herself in her room, covering every reflective surface. But it was no use. The face appeared everywhere in the patterns on her wallpaper, in the texture of her carpet, even in the food on her plate. Driven to the brink of madness, Lucy stopped sleeping, stopped eating. She couldn't escape the face, no matter where she went or what she did. It was always there, watching, waiting. In a final act of desperation, Lucy smashed every mirror, every piece of glass, anything that could show a reflection. But when she looked into the darkness of her empty TV screen, she saw the face again, clearer than ever. The last thing she heard before she lost her mind completely was the sound of static, crackling and hissing, as the face in the screen smiled at her. Story 1. When I was a kid, my parents used to leave me home alone sometimes. Both my parents worked and stopped getting a babysitter for me when I was around 10. I'm an only child, so I got used to being home alone quickly. I could make food for myself and have snacks, but mostly I watched TV or hung out in my room. We lived in a one-level house with a basement. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a living room, and a kitchen. The house wasn't big, but it never felt cramped. I was about 12 years old when this incident happened. One night I was home alone. I don't remember where my parents were, but they had left food for me. After eating in the living room, I went to my bedroom. Around 8:30 or 9 p.m., it was completely dark outside. That's when I heard our sliding glass door opening. I was used to hearing that noise because my parents went in and out to the patio all the time. The sliding glass door was connected to the dining room by the kitchen at the back corner of the house. But 5 seconds after hearing the noise, I realized it was strange because my parents weren't home. I became very worried. I started to panic, not knowing what to do. This situation had never happened to me before, and I had never thought it could. Our neighborhood was quiet and calm. I tried thinking of who it could be but couldn't come up with anyone. My bedroom door was open about a foot. I thought about closing it but didn't want to make any noise, so I stayed on my bed. I noticed I didn't hear anyone walking around. We had wood floors in the living room and dining room, so I would have heard footsteps. My TV volume was low, so I would have heard someone. I grabbed my TV remote and turned the volume down, listening closely for another 30 seconds to a minute. I still heard nothing. I started to think I might have imagined it. Feeling slightly better, I decided to check for myself. I got up and walked to the doorway. The living room was to the right, but the dining room and kitchen weren't visible from the hallway. I walked through the living room to the dining room and kitchen but saw no one. The sliding glass door was closed but not locked. This concerned me, but no one seemed to be inside. I thought maybe a neighbor closed it. I couldn't remember if the door had been open or closed before. I walked over, locked it, and looked into the patio and backyard. Everything seemed fine. I went back to my bedroom but decided to look outside from my window. Everything seemed normal. Thirsty, I picked up my empty water glass and went to the kitchen to refill it. As I was filling my glass, I heard footsteps in the living room. Someone was definitely there. I sprinted to the sliding glass door, unlocked it, opened it, and ran out without closing it. I was terrified. I didn't see who was inside but knew someone was there. Outside, I ran to the street, trying to get as far from the house as possible. I had recently gotten my first cell phone and called my mom, telling her what happened. She called the police and my parents headed home. I walked around the neighborhood until my mom called again. My parents picked me up and we drove home, where several police cars were parked. My dad spoke with the officers, who said the intruder was gone. Nothing was stolen, but several things were out of place. We went back inside, and I was scared for the rest of the night. The guy never came back, and I never saw him again. I'm just glad I left when I did. Story 2. Something weird happened to me last week. I was having a movie night by myself in my apartment. I live alone on the second floor. My apartment is fairly new and has 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a living room, and a kitchen. It was Saturday around midnight, and I was on my second movie of the night. I didn't have work the next morning. My apartment is at the far end of the hallway, next to the stairs, though people usually use the elevator in the center of the hallway. I heard the door to the stairs open and close. It sounded like someone was walking down the hallway. I didn't think much of it until I realized it sounded like more than one person, maybe almost 10. I thought it was strange but expected them to pass by. Instead, they stopped outside my doorway. I thought maybe they were going to the apartment across the hall, but it was a little ways down. Curious, I paused the movie and looked out the peephole. To my shock, there were about 10 guys standing in the hallway, facing my door. They were wearing all black with hoods, so I couldn't see their faces. No one knocked, and they just stood there. I considered asking what was going on, but thought better of it. I walked away, hoping they would leave. I couldn't feel comfortable while they were there. I tried to distract myself with the movie, but turned the volume down so they wouldn't hear it. I couldn't focus and then heard my doorknob turning. It was very quiet, but I heard it because I was already thinking about the men, and my TV volume was low. I felt even more creeped out and in danger. I stayed where I was, unsure of what to do. After about 10 minutes, I got up to check if they were gone, hoping they were. Looking out, I saw they were still there. I ran back to the couch, not knowing what to do. I didn't think I could call the police since they were just standing in the hallway. After 5 more minutes, I checked again. This time they were gone. I couldn't believe it, as I hadn't heard them leave. I was so paranoid that I kept checking the peephole every 10 minutes. Luckily, I didn't see them again. Before going to bed, I walked the hallways to make sure they were gone. I went throughout the whole building without seeing them. Finally, I went to bed around 2 a.m. However, I was woken up in the night by knocking on my door. It knocked twice after I woke up. I stayed in my bed, too terrified to get up. There was silence, and I feared they would break in. I stayed in bed for about 30 minutes before checking the door. No one was there. I went back to sleep and heard nothing more. Since then, everything has been fine. Story 1. When I was a kid, my parents used to leave me home alone sometimes. Both my parents worked and stopped getting a babysitter for me when I was around 10. I'm an only child, so I got used to being home alone quickly. I could make food for myself and have snacks, but mostly I watched TV or hung out in my room. We lived in a 1-level house with a basement. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a living room, and a kitchen. The house wasn't big, but it never felt cramped. I was about 12 years old when this incident happened. One night I was home alone. I don't remember where my parents were, but they had left food for me. After eating in the living room, I went to my bedroom. Around 8:30 or 9 p.m., it was completely dark outside. That's when I heard our sliding glass door opening. I was used to hearing that noise because my parents went in and out to the patio all the time. The sliding glass door was connected to the dining room by the kitchen at the back corner of the house. But 5 seconds after hearing the noise, I realized it was strange because my parents weren't home. I became very worried. I started to panic, not knowing what to do. This situation had never happened to me before, and I had never thought it could. Our neighborhood was quiet and calm. I tried thinking of who it could be but couldn't come up with anyone. My bedroom door was open about a foot. I thought about closing it but didn't want to make any noise, so I stayed on my bed. I noticed I didn't hear anyone walking around. We had wood floors in the living room and dining room, so I would have heard footsteps. My TV volume was low, so I would have heard someone. I grabbed my TV remote and turned the volume down, listening closely for another 30 seconds to a minute. I still heard nothing. I started to think I might have imagined it. Feeling slightly better, I decided to check for myself. I got up and walked to the doorway. The living room was to the right, but the dining room and kitchen weren't visible from the hallway. I walked through the living room to the dining room and kitchen but saw no one. The sliding glass door was closed but not locked. This concerned me, but no one seemed to be inside. I thought maybe a neighbor closed it. I couldn't remember if the door had been open or closed before. I walked over, locked it, and looked into the patio and backyard. Everything seemed fine. I went back to my bedroom but decided to look outside from my window. Everything seemed normal. Thirsty, I picked up my empty water glass and went to the kitchen to refill it. As I was filling my glass, I heard footsteps in the living room. Someone was definitely there. I sprinted to the sliding glass door, unlocked it, opened it, and ran out without closing it. I was terrified. I didn't see who was inside but knew someone was there. Outside, I ran to the street, trying to get as far from the house as possible. I had recently gotten my first cell phone and called my mom, telling her what happened. She called the police and my parents headed home. I walked around the neighborhood until my mom called again. My parents picked me up and we drove home, where several police cars were parked. My dad spoke with the officers, who said the intruder was gone. Nothing was stolen, but several things were out of place. We went back inside, and I was scared for the rest of the night. The guy never came back, and I never saw him again. I'm just glad I left when I did. Story 2. Something weird happened to me last week. I was having a movie night by myself in my apartment. I live alone on the second floor. My apartment is fairly new and has one bedroom, one bathroom, a living room, and a kitchen. It was Saturday around midnight, and I was on my second movie of the night. I didn't have work the next morning. My apartment is at the far end of the hallway, next to the stairs, though people usually use the elevator in the center of the hallway. I heard the door to the stairs open and close. It sounded like someone was walking down the hallway. I didn't think much of it until I realized it sounded like more than one person, maybe almost 10. I thought it was strange but expected them to pass by. Instead, they stopped outside my doorway. I thought maybe they were going to the apartment across the hall, but it was a little ways down. Curious, I paused the movie and looked out the peephole. To my shock, there were about 10 guys standing in the hallway, facing my door. They were wearing all black with hoods, so I couldn't see their faces. No one knocked, and they just stood there. I considered asking what was going on, but thought better of it. I walked away, hoping they would leave. I couldn't feel comfortable while they were there. I tried to distract myself with the movie, but turned the volume down so they wouldn't hear it. I couldn't focus and then heard my doorknob turning. It was very quiet, but I heard it because I was already thinking about the men, and my TV volume was low. I felt even more creeped out and in danger. I stayed where I was, unsure of what to do. After about 10 minutes, I got up to check if they were gone, hoping they were. Looking out, I saw they were still there. I ran back to the couch, not knowing what to do. I didn't think I could call the police since they were just standing in the hallway. After 5 more minutes, I checked again. This time they were gone. I couldn't believe it, as I hadn't heard them leave. I was so paranoid that I kept checking the peephole every 10 minutes. Luckily, I didn't see them again. Before going to bed, I walked the hallways to make sure they were gone. I went throughout the whole building without seeing them. Finally, I went to bed around 2 a.m. However, I was woken up in the night by knocking on my door. It knocked twice after I woke up. I stayed in my bed, too terrified to get up. There was silence, and I feared they would break in. I stayed in bed for about 30 minutes before checking the door. No one was there. I went back to sleep and heard nothing more. Since then, everything has been fine.